Hello, everyone. My name is Victor Flores. I'm the editor-in-chief of Cornell Law Review. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on the time zone that you're all in. It is Cornell Law Review's privilege and honor to host this symposium, Women on the Frontlines, COVID and Beyond. Cornell Law Review is a journal that takes pride in publishing diverse scholarship that focuses on criminal justice, reproductive rights, antitrust, corporate governance. But we also take pride in being a platform that sheds light on important ongoing issues. Again, it is our privilege and honor to hold this dialogue, this discussion on important issues, on how the role of women during the pandemic has been affected. With me here is also senior online editor, Nicholas Palakos.
Morning, everyone. Outside of the print volume, the Cornell Law Review has an online outlet, the Cornell Law Review Online. We publish smaller pieces that feature more contemporary issues dealing with legal effects of the current day. So in March, when Victor explained to me that we had an opportunity to have an online symposium that focused on the intersections of gender, race, and the ongoing pandemic, I was immediately on board. Then, as we watched a summer of protests against police brutality and structural inequalities within our criminal justice system, I became grateful for the professor leading our online symposium, Professor Michelle Goodwin. Professor Goodwin is the Chancellor's Professor of Law at UC Irvine and the founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy there. She's also the author of phenomenal pieces of scholarship, like her most recent book, Policing the Womb, The New Race and Class Politics of Reproduction, or her 2019 article in the Cornell Law Review, The 13th Amendment, Modern Slavery, Capitalism, and Mass Incarceration, two vital issues of the day. And as the author of this scholarship, I knew this symposium was in the best hands. And this became even clearer as we heard Professor Goodwin's voice in our podcast on the issues, which tackles current issues like voter suppression, the rapid changes in the Supreme Court, and LGBTQ rights. A prolific voice and the recipient of the 2021 Distinguished Senior Faculty Award for Research, the highest honor bestowed by the University of California. Without further ado, allow me to introduce Professor Michelle Goodwin.
Thank you, Victor and Nick. It is a pleasure and an honor to be working with you. One of the things that I thought about right away in March was the energy that you both brought to thinking about issues that affect the lives of women. And that was inspiring in so many different ways. Thank you so much. And Victor, thank you so much for reaching out in a very personal way to express what these issues mean for you and so many others who have parents who work in situations that are very much tied to what we're thinking about today. So I am joined by great friends, great scholars in the field who've written pieces for the Cornell Law Review online as part of this symposium. So I want to thank them and welcome them. And you saw parts of their bios in the slide deck, and I'm going to just briefly introduce them now and begin with a couple sets of questions before we hear from them and more in depth. So I'm joined today by Aziza Ahmed. She's a professor of law at Northeastern School of Law and visiting professor of law at Harvard Law School. And mind you, for each of our guests, we could spend a long time on their bios, but in the interest of time, I hope that our audience will forgive me for abbreviating. We're also joined today by Professor Lori Andrew. She's a distinguished professor of law at the University of Chicago, Kent, and director of the Illinois Tech Institutes for Science, Law, and Technology. We're also joined by Jasmine Harris, who's a professor of law and Martin Luther King Jr. Hall Research Scholar at the University of California Davis School of Law. We're also joined by Louise Perkins King. She's an assistant professor of obstetrics, gynecology, and reproductive biology at Harvard Medical School and a surgeon within the division of minimally invasive gynecologic surgery at Brigham and Women's. And our final two guests also joining us, Alison Whalen is an associate at Covington and Burling in the firm's Food, Drug, and Device Practice Group, and Mary Ziegler, who is the Stearns Weaver Miller Professor at Florida State University College of Law. So thank you all very much for joining us. So I want to begin with a more general question to you all. And please just unmute yourselves and jump right in. COVID has revealed institutional and infrastructural inequalities across our society, and we see them related to sex, we see them related to race, we see them related to disabilities, and so much more. So much has happened during the period of COVID, including Black Lives Matter uprising, responses to police violence, and also voting as mattering. I'm wondering about what has been worrying you most during this time of pandemic. And please jump in.
Well, it wasn't as if we couldn't predict that there would be a major infectious disease. I mean, we have seen that happen before with SARS, for example, and the fact that we did so badly in dealing with it in terms of lack of testing, you know, the disbelief of, say, Black women who went to an emergency room about their symptoms, so many things like that. And I'm heartened to see that in countries led by women, there's been a much better response to this. So I worry about politics. I worry about the fact that even as I sit here around me, stores are being boarded up, and we're being told that police can't offer any protection in the city I'm at now between November 1st and 16th because they expect to be dealing with perhaps a not good transition of government after the election.
I'd say there's no easy way to say there's one thing that I'm worried about, because there's so many things to be worried about. But I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot more, just as the social isolation and the requirements by governments keeps being extended, I do start to worry about the long-lasting effects on everyone, children, particularly in education. Not necessarily the physical effects of somebody actually getting COVID, but just the mental effects. And what is this going to do to us, whether we ever get back to a quote unquote normal? If we do, what will that look like? Will it be different? And then also as well, once we get out of that, is what is the long lasting impact, both mentally, physically, particularly on young growing brains? I think it's a little bit different than what we're talking about today, but it's been something that I've been really thinking about recently.
So for me, I'm particularly concerned about wasting this opportunity. And it's a strange thing to say that COVID is an opportunity, but my work and my conversation today with everyone is going to talk about how it is an opportunity. Everyone always says, oh, we couldn't possibly think about institutional reform because you'd have to break down the whole system or hit the stop button. Well, guess what? We're there, we're here, we're in the moment when we can hit the pause button. And if we don't look at institutions from a meta level and really take advantage of this moment, we're just going to continue to cycle through, as Lori said.
I just wanted to back up Jasmine on that. I have a very similar concern that keeps me up at night. I think about, when we think about, as our symposium is, the topic of the symposium is today, the impact on vulnerable communities, on Black and Latina, on Indigenous women, on people of color, that this epidemic, even if we have a mask mandate, even if we sort of prescribe better individual tools for people to change their individual behaviors, we're not going to get anywhere unless we really think about the broader structural issues. And if this moment passes us by without doing so, a lot of lives will be lost. And, we're headed to another version of this whenever it happens again.
Dr. King, you are our commentator, but right now you are joining us from a hospital. And so you're in the thick of it in that way. What concerns you most about these times?
Yeah, I am in the hospital wearing my mask as much as possible, but allowed to take it off to talk in case anybody needs to read my lips. My biggest fear is that, or my biggest disappointment, I actually agree with Professor Ahmed and Professor Harris in terms of this being an opportunity. And I hope that is a great focus of our talk today about all the opportunities for change that we're seeing as we're unmasking disparate access and disparate conditions in healthcare for various peoples. But my biggest concern, the thing that keeps me up at night, is how surprised I have been over this time period by how little support physicians and everyone working in the hospital, everybody who's essential, which expands to a great number of people, how little support we're receiving from the general populace of the United States. I was shocked at first that people would object to wearing masks. I understand their misconceptions about why they should be wearing masks and socially distancing and observing various public health measures. But they've had enough time now to think about it, and it's incredibly disheartening to see colleagues dying ill, having long-term effects from contracting COVID when they've been providing care and that's how they've contracted it, and that our populace, our wonderful American people, don't understand how they're contributing to that problem. It shocks me and it keeps me up and makes me sad, honestly.
Thank you, Dr. King. Mary, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the most concerned about the fear that keeps us from taking advantage of these opportunities. That might be because I'm the only one of us in the South. I was going on a walk the other day and passed a house with 6 Confederate flags and 6 Trump flags. And I know people of color in my community, and I know that probably the dominant emotion now before the election is not hope or optimism, but fear. And I share that too. I mean, what keeps me up at night is fear of that neighbor and other neighbors and what they're thinking when I walk with my daughter who's biracial. So I think that there's a threat of violence, unlike one we've seen in a while, that makes it harder for people to see these opportunities and harder to do anything about them if they're visible.
So, Lori, one of the issues that you raised in terms of concern and opportunity is that there are women who govern around the world who've been successful. In some ways, we can think about the leader of New Zealand. But in connecting that to what Mary just mentioned, we're also in a time during COVID where there's a governor in Michigan whose safety was threatened with individuals who were part of a nationalist organization who wanted to kidnap her and do harm. So how do we reconcile that as we think about everything else everyone has said?
Yeah, I think, in general, we know that this administration is giving priority to the wrong things and is actually inciting, all sorts of bad behavior toward women, toward people of color. I think that's a big difference. I don't know what's going to, I fear for our future, given the Constitution of the Supreme Court, how much is falling back on states as responsibilities, and at least in the time being, the federal government's willingness to cut off states who are trying to do the right social justice thing. I see this entire breakdown of the social contract, and more people saying, if it was possible to go to other countries now, as opposed to being a disfavored American for all sorts of infection reasons, they would. I get back to me next week after the election, and I'll tell you if I've had a complete breakdown or not.
Well, what's interesting is that also during this time, as families have had to be together, and to the extent that there have been families that have really taken that seriously, there's also the concerns that are raised with regard to violence in households. And we know that disparately within households, when there happens to be violence, that falls disparately on women in the households. And so those are also things that, I'm thinking about too. I have another question for you all. For those who say that the death counts that we've seen during COVID are just simply inevitable, and that we would have already seen these many deaths, or that the cases in Europe are actually spiking now so that there's nothing more that states or the federal government could do. What are your responses to that?
I think that the first response is we always see certain lives as disposable. And we saw that happen with the pandemic early on, where people would limit it to people with disabilities or elderly or, you know, older adults. And so as if somehow that was okay, where we could just dispose of those lives. And so I think the issue is really about valuing particular lives over other lives and ignoring the fact that these structural problems have been there forever and no one has addressed them either individually or across the board. So I think that for me is the signal of you know, a failure, and I think it's hard to walk away from that.
And one thing I will say is that when we try to point to other countries as either doing better or doing worse, or we're doing just as good as them, as that doesn't mean we can't try to do better. Just because another country has the same death rates or worse death rates or better death rates doesn't mean that shouldn't change, that we're trying to decrease our death rates in the United States. We should always be trying. It doesn't, you know, obviously we all need to work collectively globally, but from our perspective, we shouldn't just kind of lay on our laurels just because one country has done worse than us, or say, oh, we're testing way more than this other country, so we're doing enough, we don't need to keep striving. That's clearly not good enough right now. And then going to what Professor Harris said, I also sometimes question as to how many people are we missing that have either died or been diagnosed, particularly in our country where so many people lack access to healthcare, are afraid to go and get healthcare, whether they're because of their immigration status or because they think that they're going to get charged a lot of money that they simply do not have. And so they remain at home. And one, they either never get diagnosed and they actually have the disease and maybe survive, or they do die at home and no one ever knows that it was COVID. And so that's another thing that I think is one thing that could be skewing data here and elsewhere.
Building on what Professor Whalen just said, we're starting to see studies come out to quantify those numbers. And building off of what I had said earlier, what bothers me the most is we were completely set up to do a much better job. We had the plans in place. We know how to do it. If we could just have a national mask mandate, we've already modeled that we could save another 195,000 lives. It's very clear that we can do better with very little effort. And I expected of us as a country to have put forth our best effort, not what we've put forward. I mean, we are so much better than this and so much more capable of mounting a response to a pandemic as a country and as citizens of that country. So we could absolutely have done better. And I also support Professor Harris's comments that it clearly smacks of some people aren't worth saving, which is so disheartening to me.
Laura, you're going to jump right in there.
Sure. Well, focusing on the optimism side of this, I'm hoping we could keep in place some of the innovative programs that some states are doing. You know, Governor Pritzker in Illinois started, you know, free daycare for healthcare workers. I mean, why not have that all the time? So, you know, we are learning some things. I mean, we've become less of a, you know, addicted to consumption in some ways, you know, going over ads and things, because what's necessary is thought to be very different now in terms of holding family close and so forth. So I'm hoping we, you know, have learned in that sense more about what's important when you've got men at home too, trying to do a Zoom call with their kids all over them. You know, maybe some things will change in the workplace. I can only hope. But I think there are, as was pointed out, opportunities to change things now.
Well, with that said, I think that what we'll do is to transition to your presentations. And just for our viewing audience who are watching via YouTube and also who are with us, if you are with us on Zoom, you can place questions into the chat, and not into the chat, but into the Q&A. So please place your questions there. There's far more for us to discuss along all of these lines, but without further ado, the first of our speakers is Alison Whalen.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Hi, everyone. Before I get started, I just want to note that I'm taking part in this panel in my personal capacity and not as an associate or representative of my employer, Covington & Burling. So any opinions or statements I make today are my own and don't reflect those of Covington. So we've been discussing, and as many of you obviously know, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed disparities in a variety of areas, including incidence of disease, access to and enrollment in clinical trials, and access to and affordability of medical care. There's been a big focus during the COVID-19 trial, as well as before, about ensuring that clinical trials enroll diverse populations, particularly given that COVID and hospitalization rates and death rates are found to be higher among Blacks, Hispanics, and Latinos, the American Indians, and Alaskan Natives. My research focuses particularly on women, particularly women of color. So women of color and women in general, throughout history, well, let me take a step back. So the underrepresentation of women in clinical research throughout history is a well-recognized problem. And this stems from things like paternalism and a lack of respect for women's autonomy, particularly pregnant women. And this has caused women to be generally excluded from trials in large populations. But FDA laws, regulations, and policies that I work with typically on a day-to-day basis, in addition to those of the NIH, which I know Lori Andrews details in greater detail, they've resulted in fairly significant progress to close these gaps. In fact, recent data suggests that women's enrollment in clinical trials that were used to support new drug approvals by FDA were equal, if not greater, than men's enrollment. However, there's a lot of progress to be made in the context of pregnant women. For example, in the context of COVID-19 studies, in a study of 371 interventional trials, almost 80% of those drug trials excluded pregnant women or some sort of childbearing related exclusion criteria. This is extremely important in the context of COVID-19. Even though there's still a lot to be learned about the disease in general, there's a lot to be learned as well about the disease in pregnancy in particularly. But the CDC recently reported that preterm deliveries were 25% higher in women who were diagnosed with COVID-19. So it's imperative to include these women in studies, and the fact that they're not being included is problematic and something that needs to be addressed. Given limited time, however, I want to turn now to the experience of women of color in medical research throughout history. So on the one hand, we have women, pregnant women and women of childbearing potential who are essentially being kept off the front lines. Whereas throughout history, we have women of color who have been unknowingly and unwillingly pushed into the front lines of medical research without their knowledge or consent. And so if we probe further, we see that not all women have been treated differently in medical research. And this goes back to what we were just discussing, that it seems as though not all lives and not all bodies are treated of equal worth. And this history has implications not only for current efforts during COVID-19, but also generally the trust in the healthcare system in general, as well as government. And this has spanned from times of human enslavement, as well as up to recently, as we've recently seen with the allegations about in the immigration detention center in Georgia about medical abuse and forced sterilization. So as I said, the reasons for this are many, that their views of racism, the view that people of color are expendable, and the utilitarian belief that this research will be for the greater good. And so I just want to run through a couple of high-level examples that some of you may have heard of before of women of color in the medical setting. First, there's James Marion Sims. The experiments performed on enslaved women in the 1800s by James Marion Sims, who was known as the father of modern gynecology. However, he gained that reputation through the knowledge he gained by performing horrific and painful gynecological experiments on enslaved women who were not given the choice to refuse. Then there's a lot of instances during contraception research. The birth control pill has kind of a long, tortured, and controversial history. For example, in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican women who were generally poor, uneducated, and often desperate to avoid pregnancy and sterilization were considered far more likely to try a contraceptive pill than wealthier, more educated women. These women were not, however, informed that the drug was experimental or that they were participating in a clinical trial. Then there's Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks herself was not a participant in a clinical trial, but the taking and using of her cells without her consent is another example of how the bodies of women of color have been exploited. She was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cervical cancer and died later that same year. During treatment, a sample of her cells was taken, and it was soon found that this sample replicated at rates much greater than any other cell line researchers had ever seen. It's been used in countless developments and experiments that have given rise to things like treatments for cancer, the flu, STDs, Parkinson's, and even COVID-19. Yet to this day, her family has never been compensated or received any profits from her cells. So taking another step back, scholars have long documented this problem, that there's a history of abuse and exploitation, which has resulted in a growing, as we've all seen in COVID-19, distrust of clinical research, the medical system, and the government more broadly among women of color and people of color more generally. So the implications of this history are not new. And so some might say, why are we talking about this again now? Why write another paper? Why give another presentation? Well, the answer to this is obvious based on the discussion we were just having, is that these answers are there, but they're unresolved, and there's still inequities in healthcare and throughout society in general. So we clearly, even if we're talking about it, we're not coming up with a good solution. So unless and unable we're able to better address and mitigate the consequences of this history, these problems are always going to matter, continue to plague society, and they have to continue to be discussed. And COVID-19 has shined an even brighter light on inequities and distrust. And so it's very disheartening to see, but as well, I also take kind of some optimism that maybe this is shining a light and that we're going to start to talk about it and not stop talking about it until we actually do something. The political and social atmosphere in which the development of COVID-19 drugs and vaccines has taken place has continued to undermine Americans' trust in the process, and we really need to turn that around. Racism, discrimination, inequality, and health are colliding in ways that cannot be ignored. And all of these issues are playing a role into whether and what extent people of color feel that they can trust COVID-19 research, enroll in COVID-19 research, and ultimately receive a treatment or a vaccine, as well as trust the government's overall response to the pandemic and beyond. So it's given renewed importance and urgency to diversity in clinical trials, as well as social justice issues in general, as we saw during the summer. And so in thinking about next steps, any solution has to be multifaceted. And it's people like us who come together today with interdisciplinary approaches that are really going to make these solutions come to life. And these issues are not new, but the COVID-19 pandemic has made them all the more salient. And so there's no time like the present for folks like us and everybody else in general in society to revisit these issues with a renewed sense of passion and urgency. And I thank you for your time, and I really look forward to your questions and the rest of the discussion today.
Thank you so much for that, Ali, and raising these very important intersectional issues that date back to the antebellum period, including the experiments that Dr. Marion Sims, known as the grandfather of gynecology, that he performed on enslaved women that he rented and kept at the back of his house, says so much about who's present and who gets to speak to these issues, because what's amazing there is that in his autobiography, he wrote about how he tortured those women, but for so long, his autobiography, and he was lauded until women began reading his autobiography and said that's just simply torture. What he was doing to those women, including without providing them any anesthesia. As he wrote about, he didn't think that they felt pain. So next in line.
and yet a few years later, a year or so later, he gave anesthesia to white women when performing those surgeries. So
absolutely.
This topic in and of itself could fill well beyond 2 hours. Absolutely.
It could. So next on our agenda, we will hear from one of my personal heroes. Professor Lori Andrews.
Oh. Well, when I read that men were twice as likely to die from COVID-19 as women, I thought of Joanna Russ's 1975 sci-fi novel, The Female Man, in which women live in a utopia after men die of a pandemic. Now, a gender-specific pandemic could plausibly exist given the different biological mechanisms of men and women. Women have a more aggressive immune system response than do men. Women's hormones, too, play a role in fighting infections. Estrogen activates the immune response and can slow tissue damage. In contrast, testosterone actually helps COVID-19 enter the cells. And during previous pandemics, including the 1918 Spanish flu and the SARS outbreak, men also died at a higher rate than women did. So Alison focused on the FDA, but my interest is today with the National Institutes of Health and their $40 billion medical research budget. For the first 100 years of its existence, NIH was dedicated to finding cures for male diseases. A study of heart disease, the leading cause of death among women at the time, was undertaken on 22,000 men and no women. A federal study of health and aging proceeded for 20 years with only male subjects. Even basic biological research was done mainly on male mice, and that continues to today. So finally, in 1995, at the behest of a female researcher, Florence Hazeltine at the National Institutes of Health, who called up all the women in Congress, Congress passed a law effective in 1995 to allow women to participate in federally funded research. Even though women, but discrimination has continued. Even though 80% of drugs are prescribed for women, following the 1995 law, still the drugs were mainly tested on men. And in fact, 8 of the 10 drugs that were withdrawn from the market as harmful between 1997 and 2000 caused greater harm and fatalities in women. And a wide range of medications from antibiotics, antihistamines, antipsychotics, gastrointestinal drugs cause potentially higher levels of arrhythmias in women than men. And in fact, some drugs, such as one of the ulcerative colitis drugs, don't work at all on women, but are prescribed exclusively for men. So how can that be? Here's the problem with the 1995 law. It got women into clinical trials, but that's not enough. We need precursor research on women's cells, on female animals, so that their drugs are developed appropriately. For example, cellular differences can render some drugs useless to women, including certain pain medications, because they don't target the appropriate receptors in cells. So in 2016, the National Institute of Health adopted guidelines telling scientists to do precursor research on female animals and female cells. The appearance of COVID-19 brought a tsunami of scientific articles on the disease. In fact, by May 2020, there were more than 23,000 articles on COVID-19 in the scientific literature, and that was doubling every 20 days. So my research associate, Bora Drejoni, and I, along with students at Institute for Science, Law, and Technology at Chicago-Kent College of Law, decided to go through all that literature to see if it was complying with the 2016 guidelines that said you need to disaggregate the data by sex. And what we learned is that gender discrimination in scientific research is continuing. Despite these tens of thousands of articles, only a handful of them actually broke down the differences between men and women's symptoms. Now, some researchers, mainly female researchers, are challenging this male-centric approach. Dr. Akiko Iwasaki and her team at the Yale School of Medicine analyzed the differences between men's and women's responses to COVID-19. Women's immune systems responded in a more favorable way with an initial triggering of cytokines, which then activated an appropriate T cell infection fighting response. Men with serious COVID-19 infections did not develop enough T cell immunity, while women with serious infections exhibited a malfunction in their cytokines. So this study shows that there's a difference and gives some explanation about why women's immune systems are doing a better job, but it also shows that different treatments for men and women might be necessary. And I'm concerned right now because when I look at treatments that are ongoing in New York and in California, some of them focus on giving estrogen to men. So they're dealing with the male symptoms of COVID-19 and not the female ones. And understanding this difference in how disease manifests in women versus men is important beyond the development of drugs and other treatments. It's also important for social decisions such as insurance, Medicare, Medicaid. And I recall that when AIDS was first identified, the disease was defined completely in male terms. Since men experienced skin lesions, that was how the disease was defined, while women were having esophageal infections and cervical dysplasia. Well, what did that mean? That meant we weren't looking for treatments for women. And when Medicaid created a special fund to fund treatment of AIDS patients, women couldn't apply because the disease was actually defined in male terms. So bottom line, remedying sex discrimination in medical research is not only necessary to achieve justice, but it also may point the way for a healthier future for us all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lori. And both your paper and also that of Alison's fit so nicely together in giving us this really important backdrop about how we go forward. There's been so much talk about how essential vaccines will be, but if the backdrop of what we have in terms of vaccine testing is a male model, how successful will it be for women? And this also makes me think about your prior works too, about how so many different things, are tested on men, even when we think about the sort of seatbelt safety in cars, right? The model isn't one that actually addresses a woman's body, but is actually about a very different kind of body altogether.
And female surgeons find, I know at University of Chicago, the OR, the beds in the OR to operate on patients for different types of surgeries are too high for them. And so they are on, I know one woman who's on 2 step stools to do this operation. And, so women surgeons have more problems in their neck and back, and yet their patients do better than those of male surgeons. So imagine if we gave women the tools that they needed.
Exactly. Imagine exactly that. Well, next in line for a presentation is Professor Mary Ziegler. Mary, take it away.
So I'm also talking about a healthcare related topic, reproductive healthcare during the pandemic. And I'm a historian. So what interested me about this topic was when states were first functionally banning abortion through stay-at-home orders, I was asked, by reporters and others, is this just sort of opportunism, right? The pandemic presents yet another opportunity to restrict access to abortion or contraception. And my immediate thought, of course, was yes, but not only. So I was interested in tracing the history of efforts to paint abortion both and related, really all reproductive healthcare as unessential and also as not healthcare. And relatedly to kind of blur the line between abortion and contraception, which is something we see ongoing in debates about birth control, the contraceptive mandate, and the kind of wave of abortion bans we're likely to see soon. So perhaps unsurprisingly, given everything we've said so far, this effort to frame abortion and reproductive healthcare as unessential came at the expense of women of color and came as the product of the fight for the Hyde Amendment in the 1970s. At the time, before the Hyde Amendment, women could receive reimbursement through Medicaid for abortions, and the vast majority of women on Medicaid were women of color. So in fighting for a ban on these abortions, leading Republicans in Congress, and at the time some Democrats as well, insisted that most women had abortions for reasons of convenience. They kind of redefined the term you still hear today, abortion on demand, to mean essentially that most women who were having abortions were not having medically necessary abortions or abortions in cases of rape or incest. That argument, of course, was crucial to the passage of the Hyde Amendment, an argument that was always made in heavily racialized terms. While members of Congress didn't often officially invoke the race of the women who were Medicaid recipients, it was widely understood about whom they were speaking and why. They also made clear that the logic of an unessential health procedure is an almost inescapable one. So once you've deemed some reasons for a medical procedure unessential, all of them almost inescapably become designated the same way. So in the case of the Hyde Amendment, year on year, and this still happens now, there was an argument that perhaps some Medicaid-based abortions would be essential. So for example, in cases of rape and incest. Then of course, what happened was members of Congress, like Henry Hyde of Illinois, asserted that women, particularly low-income women, would simply lie about the reasons for abortion. So there were new requirements introduced to establish that these low-income women of color were not deceitful, as members of Congress claimed they would be. There were elaborate requirements to demonstrate that a sexual assault had actually occurred, or that a health condition diagnosed by one physician would not be enough as proof. There would need to be two. And increasingly, members of Congress argued that if it was even possible for patients to lie, there could be no exceptions, that the possibility of one exception made deceit possible and justified an outright ban on funding. Now, this argument was a wild success. If you look at the history of the Hyde Amendment, designating abortion as unessential for funding purposes had the effect of causing Medicaid abortions to plummet. And ever since then, states have been doing something similar. So you may think at first, well, this history shouldn't matter as much anymore. States that have been interested in banning abortion during the COVID-19 pandemic tend to be red states. They tend to have lifted their stay-at-home orders, marching in lockstep with the president on the idea that these orders are no longer needed. And of course, litigation about the requirement that medication-based abortion be given in person, which of course imposes an increased risk of COVID-19 transmission, at the moment are on hold, and the US Supreme Court, at least for the moment, has chosen not to wade into that dispute and to push it back to the lower court. So you may think that this was sort of an interesting phenomenon that's passed, but the Hyde Amendment story very much continued and is part of ongoing efforts to reverse Roe v. Wade. So how did it continue? The last time we were in a moment like this, when the Supreme Court seemed likely to overturn Roe v. Wade, states began introducing reasons bans. We see these again today. At the time, it was laws essentially saying that you could only get a legal abortion if you had been a victim of sexual assault or incest, or if you had certain severe and irreversible health effects of not getting an abortion. The idea, in other words, was to take the Hyde Amendment, which had worked so well to limit access for low-income women of color, and apply it to everyone else with the same desired effect in mind. That effort, of course, didn't succeed, in part because the Supreme Court declined the invitation to overrule Roe v. Wade in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. But Casey, if anything, made the idea that of framing abortion as neither healthcare nor essential even more important. The anti-abortion movement read Casey as codifying the idea that women relied on abortion to achieve more equal lives, and believed in turn that the only way to get rid of Casey, and in turn Roe, and in turn abortion access, was to show that abortion was not healthcare. And indeed, as anti-abortion activists framed it, was a way of damaging women's psyches and women's bodies. And that argument has been central to reversal strategies ever since. One from a distance might wonder why the anti-abortion movement seems to come to the Supreme Court with the same unsuccessful argument time and time again, first in Holman's Health versus Hellerstedt, again in June Medical Services, essentially arguments that abortion hurts women, when there's no shortage of other anti-abortion arguments that this conservative Supreme Court might be receptive to. And the argument in part is that arguments about the health effects of women, or excuse me, of abortion for women are central to a reversal strategy. So picking up on the idea that not only is abortion unessential, but is actually damaging, has been central to the movement's strategy before Casey, but even more so after Casey. I think this strategy has ramifications for contraception too. Many of us heard Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearings and heard her decline to answer questions about contraception, in particular, whether Griswold versus Connecticut, the court's landmark decision on marital privacy and birth control, was rightly decided. That prompted commentators to ask whether, in fact, a conservative Supreme Court might overturn Griswold or sign off on legislative limits on contraceptive access. What they don't realize is that in debates about whether abortion was considered essential care during the Hyde Amendment era, contraception was on the table, not as contraception in and of itself, but as abortion. So then as now, and during the Hobby Lobby litigation in recent years, abortion opponents defined many leading forms of contraceptive, from emergency contraception, Ella and Plan B, IUDs, and even in some instances, the birth control pill, as abortion itself. So when we're thinking about access to abortion, and we're thinking about efforts to frame abortion as unessential or unimportant, we're also necessarily thinking about contraception, because there's never been widespread agreement about where the line between abortion and birth control should be drawn. There hasn't been agreement on how common birth control drugs work, and whether they block implantation or fertilization. So for that reason, the strategies that we've seen unfolding during the COVID-19 pandemic when it comes to abortion are very much part of a longer story, one that seems to have been supercharged by Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation to the Supreme Court. So I wanted to take this opportunity to think more about what it means when we call a service unessential, and what that means about the people who need that service and whether we think they're essential too. This, of course, is true of women, but it's true of all pregnant people. And I think the message that we've seen sent by states during the COVID-19 pandemic will reverberate, particularly because these strategies are designed to have a longer shelf life, and almost certainly will. So thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, it's interesting as you talk about the health and science behind abortion and the framing of abortion as being something that's dangerous for women. What we then don't hear about in those debates, and sadly, that's not really covered by the media either, is that a person is 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by terminating it. So the very underlying science and health data is actually never really part of that conversation. And equally, as we've seen, false data related to individuals who've had abortions, whether they suffer mental health challenges or ongoing mental health challenges. What's very interesting is that also the leaving out of the data about people who become pregnant and have kids that they didn't want, and what that mental health status happens to be. Is there any responses to that?
Well, I think that there's been a politicization of data in this space. You'll often see abortion opponents arguing that the American Medical Association or the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists is pro-choice, and therefore that the data that they provide are pro-choice or are political. And I think that that's had an effect of intimidating both some medical organizations and certainly the media. So when data is politicized, the media will present the data claims from both sides without necessarily interrogating them. And it created, I think, a situation in which it's very hard for most people who are not well-versed in the science to really distinguish fact from fiction. That's true, of course, in other political issues too. I think the abortion issue was maybe a canary in the coal mine on that point, certainly not the only one. There were parallel debates about global warming where fact and spin became very blurred. But I think that became even more intensely present in the abortion debate, in part because people had such intense ideological pre-commitments, right? So they weren't ready for data that contradicted their beliefs. And I think the media often presents the claims and doesn't necessarily interrogate them.
Thanks so much for that. All right, building from there, our next presenter is Jasmine Harris. Professor Harris has been doing outstanding work making sure that more people within the legal field and beyond understand the importance of thinking in very intersectional ways about disability alongside issues of race, social justice, sex and gender equality, and that's crucial in these times. And we actually don't even see enough of it as we think about people going to vote next week and how that affects people who live with disabilities. So Jasmine, so happy that you're here, and I'm turning the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And thanks again to Victor and Nick and the Cornell Law Review for hosting this amazing group today. I want to start with the beginning of the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, I felt a little bit overwhelmed by the media headlines that said, COVID-19, the great equalizer. And I just thought, gosh, if anyone has actually worked in this area before, studied it, or lived through any pandemic, lived through any natural disaster, that they would see right through that they would understand that no pandemic, no natural disaster, no national emergency is ever an equalizer for marginalized communities. And so that's a theme that's pervasive through most of the presentations today. I wanted to share the article that I'm writing and that I've written for the Law Review. And the argument there is that the current pandemic has raised the stakes in many ways, and in some respects has cleared the way for what I call a new deinstitutionalization movement. And what I mean by that is, the hotbeds of COVID have been congregate custodial spaces. They've been prisons, jails, nursing homes, psychiatric hospitals, group homes, institutions, and you may even add to it universities, but I'm going to focus on the prior ones for these purposes. And what you see when you look at this, I forgot a very important one, which is immigration detention. So let's make sure we have that on the table as well. By looking at the effect of COVID-19 in these spaces, we can also see a really important dimension emerge. And that dimension is the effect of women of color on the front lines and those with disabilities, as well as those at the intersection of those identities, which we often forget. Although women of color may make up a smaller percentage overall of the number of people in these congregate care facilities, they make up a high percentage of the workers and the people who are on the front lines in these institutional settings. But there's also a sense in which the media is exacerbating this image of women not being on the front lines, this exacerbation of women giving them greater invisibility, and they're absent because of that, because of their sheer numbers from the conversations about reform. We've built these silos: immigration law, disability law, healthcare, and we see the world through these various lenses. My work really strives to break down those silos, as Michelle said, and to give us a unified lens around marginalization and subordination. And so I want to make 3 brief points in the short time that I have with you today. The first is the danger generally of custodial spaces. And what I mean by custodial spaces is that in all of those institutional settings that I mentioned to you, the state is charged with care, whether it is the state contracting with a third party, the privatization of prisons, the privatization of immigration detention. The state is still an actor here, and they are charged with the care of those who they have in under their possession, or at the time, or in their institutions. So I want to talk about the dangers of that, followed by the positioning of women of color, and people with disabilities in this conversation. And then third, and I think I'm going to spend the most time on the third point, which is the role of law. So very quickly, building on the excellent presentations of my colleagues here, the dangers of what I call custodial spaces. If you look at the history of institutional design, I've been really digging into how prisons were designed. I mean, very much so thinking about Foucault's work, thinking about some of the philosophers' work, but the way we build the world, and this is a principle from disability, the way we build the world tells us quite a bit about the values we have and our shared values. And so if you look at the architecture itself, they're built for containment, pure efficiency, and to promote prison labor in these spaces themselves. Very small spaces devoted to healthcare, very small spaces devoted to services such as education, libraries, etc. This is straight through a line and thread that goes through all the institutional settings that I mentioned to you. Let me bring up nursing homes, because we've talked about prisons, I've talked about women in prisons, but nursing homes have been perhaps the hardest hit with this pandemic. 20% of all COVID-related deaths are in nursing home residents, nursing home employees. That's significant. And we don't even know the numbers for psychiatric hospitals because we're not getting the data. So this goes back to the second thread, is we don't have good data on this. The methods of control are all the same. When the pandemic hit in prisons and in more punitive settings like immigration detention, the solution was, oh, we can quarantine, we'll just put people in sec reg, right? We'll put them in isolation. Well, when you put people in isolation before the pandemic, that itself is generating disability. That's a place where they just leave individuals so that they don't have to care for them. And so I think using these spaces and thinking about how we've structured these specific settings, and nursing homes have the same sort of design. I mean, they may have nicer curtains, they may have a place for books that's larger than a prison, but the ultimate structure is built for efficiency and containment as opposed to quality of life. So I want you to connect the dots across all of these spaces. That's what my work is trying to do. It's really to say, what's the method of control here? We're talking about behavioral control, nursing homes, immigration detention centers, psychiatric hospitals, the use of medication in these places to control behavior. It's the same methods of control. And the same story about privatization runs through all of them. And so it's important, why do I bring this up? It's important that we see those threads because it's important for the path forward. Let me spend a minute just mentioning why women and those with disabilities are disproportionately affected, some of which you've already heard today, so I won't go over it again. But the underlying health conditions, that social determinants of health more generally, people of color and people with disabilities have greater vulnerability with respect to high rates of diabetes, asthma, autoimmune disorders. They live in precarious housing. The income is less stable, less access to healthcare or health insurance, often living one paycheck away from eviction or from extreme poverty. But the importance of thinking about women and those with disabilities is we often think about people who are not the most marginalized in these pandemics. And if we center our analysis on the most marginalized, it gives us a different perspective. And here's what I mean. Women and people with disabilities, and women with disabilities as well, they have ecosystems. I mean, we all have ecosystems around us, but when we look at women in particular, we're talking about the effect on communities. And we need to see the effect on the children that are left behind, the families that are depending on people who are left behind. And so it gives us a different way of looking at not only the problem, but the solution. And that's that interconnectivity, recreating the social contract. This seems a little bit lofty, so I'm going to move very quickly to the third point, which is what's the role of law in all of this? And so we have an example of Deinstitutionalization, we had it in the disability context in the 1970s and the 1980s for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and some with psychiatric disabilities. There was a move to deinstitutionalize, to close down those congregate care facilities because they were prone to health problems, because the sunlight didn't reach it. They lacked accountability. But frankly, it was because of the publicity aspect. The 1970s and 1980s, you had people like Bobby Kennedy going into the Willowbrook State School in upstate New York and saying it looked like a snake pit. You had Geraldo Rivera, which for whatever we think, we may think of Geraldo Rivera, he blew the whistle on the Willowbrook State School. And he snuck in cameras. And it was the first image of looking at the bodies of people with disabilities in just dire conditions. I mean, one of the most striking examples from Geraldo Rivera was that he says the smell and the feel of that institution just overwhelmed him. He'll never forget. So the publicity plays a big part in it. And I think that's why it's important that our conversation include that. So let me just jump to the last role of law. The lawsuits that we're seeing right now, we're seeing deliberate indifference as a major way and path forward. We're seeing the use of the Americans with Disabilities Act creatively. We're seeing the Eighth Amendment cases as another way to think about deinstitutionalization. And just to conclude, I want to leave you with a question that I'm going to pick up in my work more broadly, which is, if we think past silos and we think about institutional redesign, I want everyone to think about two things. The first is, do we want short-term reform or do we want long-term reform? And if we really want to move past this and think about opportunities, we need to think about institutional redesign, and movements like abolition can help us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Jasmine. Your talk was so rich with so many different areas to think about, from the rule of law to the ways in which people are framed, and then also the importance of doing the centering work. And it fits together with so many of the presentations that we've heard about. But, you know, at the core of it, it makes me think about pathologizing and how individuals who are pathologized, and, you know, once you're pathologized, that's how you're responded to in society. It's also then how law dictates to you and also about you. And it seems that with the communities that you've been talking about women of color, people with disabilities, these are communities that over time, through the rule of law, have been so deeply stigmatized. And in thinking just about Mary's talk about reproductive rights and disability and women eugenics in the United States, right? I mean, it's just core and central there. So, you know, with the work that you're doing, are you finding that there are more people who are beginning to understand the importance of lifting up this discourse? Are you encouraged at all?
Let me say that I'm encouraged by this group, and let me say that I'm encouraged by the organization, the grassroots movements that are forming to really get out this information and make it more public. For example, Michelle, the discussion you had recently with Dawn Wooten, who was the whistleblower at the Georgia INS facility, that was incredibly powerful on so many levels. So I'm incredibly hopeful, because I think women like Dawn are coming forward. They've always come forward, but now I think people are listening in a way that they haven't before. So that's the opportunity piece.
Thanks for that. And she is incredibly brave, right? Woman of color, Black woman nurse who's a whistleblower who came forward about the alleged sterilizations taking place in US custody against women of color who are immigrant detainees there. So there it is, all right there. Okay, our final presentation, last but certainly not least, is with Professor Aziza Ahmed. So Aziza, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Nick. And thank you all for these wonderful presentations today. My contribution to the symposium really tries to connect up the politics of the CDC that we're seeing today with the active political meddling, but also a long history of the CDC as a political institution with the impact that it's having today on women of color, particularly poor women of color, particularly Black and Latina women. And in that sense, it really connects up to a lot of what everyone has been saying. You know, I'm adding another institution to the mix, like the NIH and FDA, as Alison and Lori did, talking about the politics of science that we see as endemic in the abortion conversation, as Mary, and like Jasmine, trying to recenter on a different community of people that have really been left out of the conversation. On one hand, hyper visible, and on the other hand, totally invisibilized. So the question of politics, just to remind everyone, not that we're not still living this, but the question of politics in the administration of this disease response has been front and center. In the COVID pandemic, concerns, of course, began with President Donald Trump's misleading statements about COVID-19, placing millions of Americans at risk of contracting the virus, and many people died. In highly publicized events, as you all remember, the Trump administration also sought to alter CDC guidance against the best evidence of the time. So on September 23rd, as we were reaching 200,000 deaths, the head of the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes for Allergy and Infectious Disease, and the Food and Drug Administration testified before the Senate Health, Education, and Labor and Pensions Committee on the response to the pandemic. Legislators were concerned by ongoing attempts of the Trump administration to interfere with the work of the agencies, and a key area of questioning was about political meddling in the scientific response to the epidemic. In response to the questioning by legislators, heads of agencies and departments, including Robert Redfield, director of the CDC, argued that they were doing their best to protect their organization from political interference. And here I argue, and this is a controversial argument, that this framing in which the CDC is operating best when it's untouched by politics hides the reality that the CDC has always been an agency shaped by the ebb and flow of social, political, and economic influence from politicians, activists, and the executive branch. The CDC, in other words, is situated in political and social context, and it should be held accountable for its actions and transformed to be more responsive to the most vulnerable people. To be sure, I'm not suggesting that facts don't matter or that we just devolve into a political battle at the CDC. Facts matter, and the CDC has always been and will continue to be guided by its core practices of epidemiological research to understand disease, to provide guidance to communities, and publish information about health issues that is based in scientific evidence. Yet understanding the CDC as an agency that comes from politics and society, and not simply a reflection of what the world is in the world of disease and health, is necessary to understand the consequences of the agency's actions. Understanding this, I would argue, matters now more than ever. Although, as Lori mentioned in her presentation, we saw this with the AIDS struggle as well. This is because the CDC, as an agency subject to outside influence, reveals how its guidance and the protective measures offered by the agency's public health messaging does not apply equally across the population. So in other words, the protective effects of the CDC's guidance applies differently depending on where you are and how you are situated. Some people lose, other people win. And in the case of COVID, these losses can be deadly. And I'm arguing, and this is sort of an activist point as well, that we can demand change because the CDC is not hermeneutically sealed and because the agency has to do better. I'm arguing here today that the CDC's public health guidance should be a place of political reckoning, a place to advocate to ensure that communities are being protected from pragmatic decisions that will be the outcome of listening to the guidance document, from reopenings, whether or not to reopen schools, to accessing testing. Now, of course, while everyone has been impacted to some degree by the COVID pandemic, as Jasmine powerfully pointed out in her presentation, anyone who is in a community of color or is marginalized or has experienced any disaster or epidemic in their life before sees through the claim that this is going to impact everyone equally. At any given point in time, the CDC's guidance impacts different people differently. Of course, some people, we could call them the lucky ones, though certainly it's not luck that led many of us to be able to shelter at home and work free from exposure to the virus. But others, particularly the poor, the epidemic produced financial ruin as business closures called unemployment numbers to skyrocket. And this created a cascading effect resulting in housing insecurity through evictions through evictions. This had grave impact on women of color, particularly Black and Latina, many who work in the service industry, the closure of businesses, I mean. And this resulted in financial instability as well, especially where women are, and is often the case in minority communities, the primary breadwinners of their family. But even where women of color remained employed, and it's almost the case, you know, in thinking through the various versions of the guidance that the CDC has offered over time, it just happens over and over again that Black and Latino women cannot get out of the bind that they are in with regard to exposure. It was often their employment in essential services that placed women at risk of contracting SARS-CoV-2. Many of these jobs are traditional healthcare settings, from nursing assistants to medical assistants, in which approximately 50% of the labor force is made up by women of color. In these settings, exposure to the virus placed healthcare workers in danger. Increased engagement in the gig economy, delivering food, for example, and in sectors like agricultural work also placed workers at risk. For Latino workers, for Latinx workers, meatpacking plants became hotspots early in the pandemic, placing thousands of workers at risk. 87% of the people infected in meatpacking plants were racial minorities. Households themselves tragically proved to be risky environments where conditions are crowded and multiple generations can often reside together in communities of color. As a recent study in the Journal of the American Medical Association showed, utilizing data from the universal testing of pregnant women in New York City, the built environment, and this comes back to the point that Jasmine made about the built environment, they looked at the built environment. They measured by household membership, household crowding, and low socioeconomic status were associated with a higher prevalence of the coronavirus. And the combination of housing conditions and being an essential worker has now been directly connected to the vulnerability of children contracting coronavirus. Black and Latinx children are dying at higher rates in the pandemic. And this can be explained, as noted by the CDC, that essential workers are at higher risk for exposure and therefore higher risk of intra-household transmission. Then, of course, this brings us back to the question of healthcare, and this ties into Alison's presentation as well with regard to the ongoing structural discrimination. Lori mentioned this as well, Jasmine as well, the ongoing structural discrimination in the housing context. But African-American and, in the healthcare context, African-American and Hispanic Americans are less likely to be insured than other racial groups. In 2013, 40% of Hispanics and 25% of Black Americans were uninsured compared to 15% of white Americans. And over the last few years, Latino and Black children topped the charts for losing health insurance. Latino children in particular have been impacted by the Trump administration's new public charge rule, which takes into consideration an immigrant's use of public benefits for over 12 months when determining admissibility for an individual. Immigration admissibility. And this could mean that the individuals are less likely to seek out health services when in the case in an event of potential coronavirus infection, but also for the underlying conditions that exacerbate COVID, as Jasmine mentioned. And when people do not seek out services, they must contend with health discrimination in clinical settings. Discrimination, of course, contributes to both distrust in the healthcare system and maltreatment in the healthcare system. So I'm just gonna, just to say that this is the distributional effect. This is how we're seeing the coronavirus play out. And at least one more point of advocacy, I think, could make a difference. This is forcing the CDC to not only acknowledge the structural determinants, which they have done. The structural determinants literature is vast, and the CDC has taken that into account. They've looked at structural issues like housing and employment, but also demand that the CDC act on and provide guidance and demands that the government be more responsive. We saw this a bit with the eviction moratorium. We could change the nature of the CDC guidance, I would argue. It would incentivize the CDC to demand that when we protect ourselves from disease, we begin to remedy the underlying causes of vulnerability to illness. But in order to do any of this, we have to first see the CDC as an institution willing to transform itself. And this is where I think advocacy can make a difference by treating the CDC as an agency open to change, rather than coming back to this idea that we push over and over again, that the CDC operates best when it's politically isolated, that it should be protected from political interference. Instead, I'm arguing it should be held accountable to the communities that are most impacted. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Aziza. And your work covers a broad spectrum with regard to the CDC. I know that you have a book that you're completing right now that looks at the CDC and and when we first understood HIV and AIDS and the response of the CDC and the federal government. Do you see any things that are similar between that period of time that you're studying and what it is now that we've been seeing with the CDC and the political structures that are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. I think a lot about social movements, and one of the things that has been a little bit disheartening, I think, is the way, as progressives, we often say, "Oh, well, the CDC, it needs to lead with science, it needs to lead with evidence," even though we've learned time and time again that, in fact, the CDC, while it claims to lead with science and evidence, that the social environment actually shapes the kinds of questions the CDC is asking, the kind of guidance that they're putting out into the world. We saw this so clearly. You referenced my work on AIDS, and Lori mentioned the AIDS story as well, that women's rights activists actually pressed the CDC to change their medical definition of AIDS. That was a feminist victory in the AIDS context. And I'm in a way, I'm trying to return us to that moment in which we see the CDC as a site of advocacy and for us to see the CDC as a site of advocacy and activism.
Thank you so much, Aziza. I can't wait until we hear Louise's comments and then we get back to the Q&A, because these papers all fit so very well together. And I should inform our viewers as well that a number of you also have commentaries that are coming out in Ms. Magazine that have been flowing this week, and then later on will be at the Harvard Bill of Health. They are two of our co-sponsors, and we'll talk more about our other co-sponsors. So for those of you who want a sneak peek at what our panelists have written about, then go to msmagazine.com and check out their commentaries, and then look for them at the Harvard Bill of Health in just a few weeks. And so without further ado, Dr. Louise King to give commentary about these papers.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I've learned a lot. I've read the papers or advanced copies of them, and thank you to Michelle, Victor, and Nick for inviting me, and to all the other commentators for sharing your points of view. I've learned so much. The theme that I had seen as I was reading the papers and emerging as we're talking is how illness and crisis unmask seemingly unrelated issues, or issues that were more accurately described as previously ignored. And certainly I see this daily in my medical and surgical practice. My patients undergo procedures for one urgent issue or semi-urgent issue, only to realize during the recovery all the other things that are coming up for them that have been ignored or not adequately treated, and that we now need to address to get them back on their feet. And so in a similar way, I feel our country is now profoundly ill with this pandemic. And as we are trying, and in my opinion, failing miserably to battle it, we're seeing in stark relief all the inequities and wrongs that we've too long ignored. It reminds me of a quote by Dr. Mary Bassett, a professor at Harvard School of Public Health. She said this a year ago, though. She said, "This epidemic is complicated, and like all epidemics, it tracks along fissures in our society." At the time, she was talking about the opioid crisis. So we keep running into these different things that make us think, oh, we really need to fix things, and then we keep getting back to regular life. So as Lori Andrews had said earlier, let's be optimistic. As many of you have said, let's see opportunities for change. And I see your papers and your presentations today as pointing out areas where we could be incredibly aggressive in seeking change. To name a few of our problems, and many of your presentations have called them out, but just to consolidate our calling of them out. Our healthcare is twice as expensive as most other high-income countries, yet many Americans don't benefit at all from that excess spending. We have the highest prevalence of diabetes, heart disease as compared to those other countries, and that spend less than us, and asthma rates also are approaching being higher than those other countries. And these chronic conditions that I've mentioned are specific and important because they disproportionately affect communities of color. Without access to reliable, comprehensive health care that is not tied to employment, many Americans, and especially Americans of color, have little access to the preventative care that would forestall those diseases. Then this results in poor health as they become sick and access what care they can. Typically through our emergency departments, they then face crushing medical debt because nothing is covered. And the 3 chronic conditions that I've highlighted are the primary ones that raise the risk for developing severe and deadly COVID-19 complications, along with the gender disparities that were mentioned in the discussion of opportunities for research. Add to all of this structural racism that Americans of color experience through a lifetime of discrimination. The National Urban League's 2020 State of Black America report, which was called Unmasked, hence my reference to it a few times, examined the economic, health, civic, and other social systems impacted by COVID-19 and noted that the pandemic has exposed inequalities once hidden along the margins of society. These high rates of unemployment, poor access to technology, health disparities, to name a few. So in our symposium today, we've focused on how the pandemic has also unmasked sexism in our country. And our first 2 commentators talked about research and disparities in access to research for women, and specifically for persons who are pregnant. Certainly that's been an exceptional problem. The American College of OBGYN has come out to call for greater inclusion of women, including persons who are pregnant, in research. And I do hope that there will be a better access to those research studies of COVID. But this is a pervasive problem of inequitable distribution of not only research opportunities, but funding. In my own work as a surgeon who specializes in women's healthcare, most of the diseases I treat receive little to almost no funding from the NIH: fibroids, endometriosis, pelvic pain, but also funding for the actual interventions that we might have. So for example, if I have a woman with vaginal atrophy who seeks vaginal estrogen to help her with sexual function, she can't get it paid for at all under any plan, whereas a man can access Viagra impressively easily. So, you know, the pandemic is unearthing these issues. Long-standing issues are being brought into focus of our continued failure to achieve equitable numbers of women in research. We have to be mindful of our history. As Alison had pointed out, we have a poor history of abusing women when we include them in research, but that does not mean that we can't move forward in an equitable fashion. So while women are not included in representative numbers in research, they are recipients of excessive legislative attention when it comes to abortion. As Mary Ziegler noted, you know, as the pandemic is killing more people in the United States than in any other country, and I'm quoting her paper at the moment, many of them Black or Latinx, the economy is taking a nosedive, and yet states begin to impose stay-at-home orders. Conservative lawmakers move to ban abortion. They determined that it was an unessential medical service. And in the debates about medical service and elective services that came up so much in the media and were huge debates for us in hospitals trying to decide what we could triage and couldn't triage, reproductive access to any kind of care that was reproductive in nature certainly was at the forefront of things that were cut as elective. And seeing reproductive care, whether it's contraception, abortion, or other things related, for example, access to IVF, seeing those as elective makes women's health something that, as Mary Ziegler has written in her paper, makes that something that's subject to moral decisions as opposed to healthcare decisions. Unacceptable. And now is the time and an opportunity for us to change that. Really briefly, to leave time for questions, I learned so much in listening to Professor Harris and about marginalized communities, and specifically these hotbed spaces and custodial spaces, and how this represents an opportunity for us to now learn that we need to redesign those institutionalized spaces. And I think also maybe expand that to say we need to redesign how we make space in all of society for persons. The example that comes to my mind most readily is one of neuroatypical children who have so little access to educational opportunities during this pandemic, or neuroatypical adults. I have a lovely student who was enamored with the fact that we went remote, because for him, that was better. You know, that made his life much easier. And why couldn't we have just afforded him that option at the outset? And finally, the excellent presentation by Professor Ahmed, Aziza Ahmed, I'm still processing it. I'm biased. I mean, I've grown up in medicine. So I grew up in law too. I have a law degree, but I grew up in medicine. And so the CDC is science, I mean, I'm really stuck with that. So I'm still processing what you proposed. But I think that if I could take what you've said and expand as well on that and say, I hope that we can advocate through science. So often when I feel that something is happening politically in the CDC, it's bad science. It's advocacy using twisting. It was made reference to earlier, and how the media has fact and spin. So frequently the political actions that I see initiated at the CDC result from spin and science that's not actually rigorous. So advocacy through good science. And clearly significant reform is needed. So again, in sum, to circle back, as I mentioned in my own feelings, I'm so disheartened and disturbed over the past months by everything that's happened, but I am trying to be as optimistic as I can. And in these presentations, I see so many opportunities to change things that have been a problem for so long. So thank you again for the opportunity to talk today.
And thank you. So now let's get to the thick of our conversation. And for our attendees, please feel free to use the Q&A function to place in your questions. For those of you who are joining us on live stream, you can tweet us your questions as well. So get us your questions and we will push them forward. So starting with a question from one of our viewers, aside from the healthcare biological factors, how are women specifically socially affected by COVID-19? And I'll open that up to everybody. So, what's unique about what women are experiencing right now during COVID? You can all turn on your mics and just jump in.
Just from a medical standpoint, women's healthcare was deeply affected. A lot of the things that we would typically operate on, we put off. And for example, abnormal bleeding, excessive menses, fibroids, endometriosis, pelvic pain, IVF. And it all resulted at one point in the governor of New York putting forward a declaration that essential services do include services for women for these both reproductive and medical conditions. From the standpoint of my patients, I have a lot of patients whom I can't get in to see because they have childcare issues or transportation issues or have lost their job and insurance. And their health is definitely impacted greatly, although it's very difficult to quantify all of that into a definitive study.
Yeah, I would say,
Go ahead.
From a social perspective, that women taking on even more of a burden of childcare, and not only childcare, but now education, and trying to deal with teaching their kids, as well as I know many teaching kids basically full time from 8 to 3 almost, and especially when their kid is young in an elementary school, not as self-sufficient, and then from 3 o'clock to maybe 3 in the morning, then they're working their job. And so that disparate burden, I'm not saying that, men haven't stepped up. I'm sure there's many instances that they have, but just I think the greater burden of general domestic related responsibilities on women is another effect.
Yeah, I think relatedly, employers not being understanding of that. There was a big kind of kerfluffle at my university for a while when the university was saying that childcare would not count as a sort of reason for being away from work anymore. And unsurprisingly, as you can imagine, this policy was not being applied to the higher income people within the institution. It was being applied to lower income, predominantly non-white staff. And the university, after lots of outcry, backtracked on this, but we see this happening across institutions. We see women dropping out of the workforce because of childcare responsibility. So it's not simply a function of who's doing childcare, it's a function of a lack of support for caretaking work in our institutions and our places of work, which is something that's affecting a lot of people.
I'd like to go back as well to the conversation about domestic violence and how the stress in particular of this time and the invisibility that everything is now in the household increases the chances of abuse. We're seeing in the disability context an uptick in disability related hate crimes, in disability related abuse and neglect cases. The other issue I want to bring in is race and say that in particular communities of color, you're seeing greater policing overall. And so that is going to generate, it's going to generate more jails and prisons being populated. It's going to just continue that cycle. But with respect to women in particular, I know many mothers are having to really encourage their children to not even go out and play in some communities because it's being so heavily policed.
I think something else, just to add another layer that we haven't been hearing too much about, but I get a sense that this is probably happening, is that with the increased housing instability, with the way these issues intersect with violence against women, with job loss and unemployment, we're going to see women lose custody of their children. It flows with sickness. It flows from these issues, and at some point we're going to have to turn to that and think about how families are actually being impacted and changed by this.
Yeah, and kind of going along with that, say a woman in a marginalized population is diagnosed with COVID, she has to go into the hospital. How much more likely is she during that whatever time period she's in the hospital to lose her children when compared to a white woman who is in the hospital, in terms of losing her children to the system? I think I have no idea. I haven't looked into that, but that would be something very interesting to think about if that research is out there or can be done. I think that would be very enlightening to see if there's a difference there.
And if I may just add to that, I think this is a point where we need more data as well. We need to look and see, for example, parents with disabilities are more highly surveilled in terms of responsibilities in their contact with the government for government services and supports. And so as a result, they are being, like I said, this over policing is happening. And so they're more likely to be taken to court and have their parental rights challenged. And so I think we need to be really cognizant of, even within just parents, who's going to be the most affected.
So again, if you've got questions, place them in the Q&A. Here's another question, which is, what do we do with community suspicion? And let me just add to that, because the questioner says that both hinders access, yet given realities is necessary and valid. So we could think about that within the context of domestic violence, but at the same time, the policing that you're talking about, Jasmine, or we could think about, Aziza, what you're talking about in terms of the CDC and the necessity of the CDC is playing a crucial and pivotal role during this time. And yet you've also talked about political capture at the same time. Lori and Alison, you both have talked about the importance of us getting a vaccine now, but on the flip side of that, the failure to actually include women in some of these studies. And yet at the same time, when women have been included in some studies, they've been subjected to non-consensual medical research and also exploitation. So how do we balance these issues of trust with institutions that are pivotal to moving us out of crisis, but that have also played central roles in exploiting women or not valuing women's constitutional rights?
I think part of the issue comes from lack of representation. And I think that we need to make some big movement in, for example, getting Dr. Lindsay's studies funded. You know, I'm struck by the fact that only 23% of the tenured faculty in the sciences are women. The fact that equally qualified women get much lower NIH grants, and that women entrepreneurs get 2% of venture capital, even though women started companies make more money. And so I think that part of it is, you know, actually not being understood by your practitioner in some, you know, in some way. And I think that kind of everything I came across about knowledge of the immune system, women's hormones, and all that, and how it might interface with infection, it was done by female researchers. So we're losing a lot, and a lot of it is about an understandable lack of trust, where you had, you know, white male doctors thinking blacks don't feel pain, women don't feel pain, women complain too much, you know, or even the male researchers originally at NIH saying, oh, you know, women are just too complicated, you know, they cycle and drugs have a different impact on them at different times of the cycle, but that's information that we actually need. So part of it is representation.
Yeah, I would similarly say it's trying to get it so that it's not all coming from the outside in and coming from the inside out. And so whether it's something about healthcare, you know, having community healthcare within the community, as opposed to them having to go outside the community where it's not their community. They don't feel safe. They don't feel comfortable. But I think at the same time, it's also important not to lose sight that we don't just need the same types of people being represented within that community. We also need personally, and I, you know, to plug them, we need people like Victor and Nick who are willing to give a platform to the people within that community. So like Victor and Nick, you know, recognizing the importance of women and people of color and giving us that platform to talk about it today and give us, you know, the power and to raise our voices. And it's that same thing as getting people from the outside recognizing the need for people from the inside to have that same platform to keep building up and to gain that trust.
I would add to that as well that this is an opportunity for us to think about different models of healthcare. And so one way that has been successful in many other countries, and one way that we've blocked in terms of law and licensing restrictions is the use of community health workers. So using community healthcare workers from those particular communities has been shown to reduce mental health issues and chronic mental health issues significantly. And so part of that is changing the cultural norm around seeking mental health care. And that's that cultural competency piece that I think Alison was talking about. And I think these are really concrete ways that we can use law to advance some of the conversation that we have and we're having here today.
And going along with that, in terms of increasing representation, is opening up access to the training needed to become a community healthcare worker, so that there aren't all of these you know, hoops that, I mean, obviously you need to jump through certain things and, you know, show that you can do the work you need to do. But in terms of, you know, the costly licenses that are required, and in our country, the costly education that is required to basically do this type of work, that just imposes so many barriers to increased representation. So if we could, as you said, Professor Harris, kind of figure out ways to do it in a way that actually opens up access, and, you know, thinking about all these licenses, and if licenses are necessary, do they really need to cost as much as they do, and things like that.
Yeah, and if I was going to add to that, I would say that, you know, it's interesting if we center the actual institutions like the NIH and the FDA and the CDC. I mean, when we think about community suspicion and what, you know, the CDC is currently facing a legitimacy crisis. And when it emerges from this, it's going to have to, you know, re-embed itself in society as an institution that is capable of doing the right thing. And part of that is is telling the public that we can be held accountable for our actions, that we won't just be tinkered with, from at the highest levels, and allow for that to continue. And I think that requires accountability mechanisms being built in, community participation. We already see this with the NIH and the FDA, so there's no reason that the CDC couldn't do some of this as well. In fact, what I'm thinking of with regard to the NIH is Henrietta Lacks. And, a few years ago in the New York Times, there was a really interesting series of articles about the HeLa line of cells and, the decades of research it produced and how it left the family vulnerable to having all this information out there. And so now the family sits on some of the advisory boards with regards to the cells that were derived from Henrietta Lacks's body. And we can think of ways and to build in accountability to reintroduce ideas of trust in our institutions.
Yeah, sorry I misspoke before. I was talking about funding Dr. King's work. But CDC has involved itself in the social realm when it was a benefit to them. Like they said, oh, violence is a public health issue, when it meant they could get a lot more money for it, as opposed to, taking on some of the issues that you've talked about with housing and so forth. So there's a precedent for it, but we'd like to, so we'd like to push them along in that way, as you're suggesting.
Yeah.
Go right ahead. Well, I just want to add one piece that you just put in the chat, which maybe you'll speak to, which is that women's surgeons, lifting up the pay disparity aspect that pre-existed COVID, but that is relevant during COVID. So Dr. King, you've said women's surgeons are paid 70% of what male surgeons are paid, and women's surgeries are reimbursed at 2/3 of that of anatomically similar surgeries in men. What explains that?
That's a
$1 million question, right?
Yeah. Well, it's complex. There are a number of lovely studies that get into some of the underlying causes, but basically it's sexism. That's an easy explanation in terms of why women surgeons are paid less. But the surgeries also, the vast majority of women in surgery are in gynecologic surgery or surgery for women. And then the surgeries that are performed on women bill out at 2/3 the rate as of similar anatomical surgeries in men. And that's been the case. There have been multiple studies of that. It's not changed since 1995. So one way to address some of this is to create equitable pay structures that reimburse for, the same for either a man or a woman surgery. And that would actually then trickle to address the fact that, most women surgeons are gynecologic surgeons, so they would benefit from that. I actually also was going to comment on, as you were all talking about more community involvement and the CDC needing to grow trust again within the community. I think a lot of our problem in healthcare in the United States centers around how we structure billing. So I am only paid for operating. I'm not really paid if I don't operate. So that's a perverse incentive that then makes me want to operate all the time. And that's not what every patient needs. Instead, if we didn't have what is called fee for service and instead had bundled payments or outcome payments or however you want to couch it, then my focus becomes the patient. It should be anyway. And frankly, for me, it always is anyway. But then I'm incentivized to have my focus as the patient and my focus as the community, because I want everybody with my patient and the broader community that I'm then in charge of to be getting the best preventative care they can, to get the best care that they can, to get them back on their feet or whatever it might be. And this has been tested at the Kaiser system because, of course, that's their model. And in my field of gynecologic surgery, where we have all these disparate issues and we have less pay for women's surgery and all those problems, and we also had racial disparities at that Kaiser, in these Northern California Kaiser hospitals in terms of access to minimally invasive surgery, which is just one thing they were measuring so they could have an outcome to look at. When they made sure that they paid their surgeons essentially the same as everybody else, brought the pay up, and ensured that they were very careful about making access available to high volume surgeons who could do the jobs well and could do them quickly. As they did that, and their care was focused on getting patients the care that they needed, geared towards them so that they would have the best outcomes and make the best use of the money they had as a big pile, they saw that their rates of minimally invasive surgery went up and racial disparities in access to that surgery went down. So as we change our focus to a different way of bundling care and not fee for service, we naturally move towards a more equitable scenario in terms of delivery of care. So that's one thing I hope to see come out of all of this.
So here's another question, which is, what's the role of law in affecting the kinds of changes that your papers speak to? Jasmine, you specifically have a section of your paper that's devoted to the rule of law, but some wonder whether law happens to be enough, because underlying the very issues that you're talking about are endemic social inequalities that go with stereotypes, stigmas, and other things. Lori, you mentioned that, look, there are people who think that Black people experience different levels of pain, and women too. When you think about it, just a few years ago at the University of Virginia, there was a study that was done of first year, second year, third year, and fourth year medical students and residents. And what was so disheartening, what was important, but also disheartening, was that these students, by a large percentage, had many of these same kinds of implicit biases and also stereotypes that Black people have different skin density. Black people don't feel pain in the same way. Black people's blood coagulates in a different way. So if we sort of see all of that, does law really have a role in addressing any of it?
I think that's the question, right, of the hour or the second hour. I think that we need to ask the preliminary question, which is, can we both have short-term reform and long-term reform? So can we think about institutional redesign while at the same time using existing laws in new ways? So my paper for this symposium talks about using, if we're going to think about short-term reform, which I have to say short-term might be okay for Band-Aid work, but we need to do the hard work now. But the short-term reform using the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, using the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504, using these in creative ways in prisons and jails, in immigration detention facilities, because there's a lot of overlap with respect to the affected population. There are people with disabilities in those spaces disproportionately, or their disabilities are being created and generated in those spaces. And so I think for the short term, we absolutely should think about using disability law in more creative ways. However, I think that's not the entirety of our project right now. We need to be thinking about how we redesign these institutions more broadly, in which case I think, Michelle, you're absolutely right. I'm not sure that law has a lot to do with that, other than to say, we need we need to have these normative discussions about what our priorities are first. But disability offers a lot to these discussions because we think about principles of universal design and how from the very beginning you consider the most marginalized communities and their needs. And that's going to be part of, or at least my vision of redesign.
I think some of the regulations that exist have limitations, but if you think about NIH $40 billion annual budget this year, they may be ignoring regulations, but we need to tie the money to follow compliance. And so in my paper, I suggest things like, if you do not talk about research on precursor, on animals, on cells, the difference, and you don't disaggregate data by male and female in your scientific studies, and you apply for an NIH grant, you are banned for a certain period of time for getting funding. And so is your university. Similarly with the FDA, I would have a mechanism like that where real money is at stake, because I think that talks more than the regulations like the 2016 guidelines at NIH, which really have no penalties associated with it. So, I mean, many of these programs, the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, are playing with our money, you know, like it's $40 billion of taxpayer money. I'm like, if it was a biotech company in which I had a stake through my taxes, I would expect something. And so we need to make our expectations known and look for solutions that tie the regulation to the budget.
Yeah, and thinking from an FDA perspective, this is more of a short-term band-aid. It doesn't solve the underlying social inequities. It's really just an incentive potentially to get pharmaceutical companies to enroll more diverse trials. But there are these things called priority review vouchers for certain things like pediatric diseases, as well as rare diseases, and in the medical countermeasure space. So thinking about, could there be some sort of way to do a priority review voucher that if you get approved based on enrolling and your trial was representative, had a diverse population, you might be eligible for this priority review voucher, which then you can then use with your next drug to speed up your drug review process with FDA, or you can sell that drug to another pharmaceutical company, and these can go for almost upwards of $100 million for a pharmaceutical company to sell it to another. And so there are huge incentive for pharmaceutical companies to do certain things throughout the research process, and if one of those is ensuring diverse enrollment, whether it be people of color or whether it be pregnant women, you know, that's a potential carrot in a way, rather than a stick. But as I said, it doesn't solve the underlying inequities, but in the short term, you know, it might help move in the right direction.
I think in the lesson of abortion history is that I think progressives have both over and undervalued law. I think overvalued in the sense of a sort of almost perverse preoccupation with saving Roe at the expense of everything else, even in the context of reproductive healthcare, and especially in the context of reproductive healthcare for women of color, and undervalued in the sense of undervalued the courts. I think now we see the really kind of stunning dominance of the right when it comes to judicial nominations. That's not just an accident. That's the product of decades of planning and history and kind of deprioritization among progressives to some extent. So I think there's always, I think, a tendency to kind of either despair so much of the limits of law as a tool that you lose sight of its potential, or to invest the law with almost sort of supernatural powers to do what it can't do. And I think the important thing is to sort of gravitate to neither of those extremes and try to see, is Professor Harris was saying, law for what it is and use it for that without then attributing to it magical powers it doesn't have and being disappointed when it doesn't deliver on impossible promises. So
I think also there's the role of the law sort of deep in the background, you know, that the way the law disenfranchises. I'm thinking here of, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates' great work in the Atlantic and the Contract Buyers League and housing, and how housing discrimination played out and how it came down to contracts, and how you have these deep and vast situations of structural inequity and inequality that have marginalized groups of people to the point where you cannot get out unless we have major structural transformation. And that our American tendency to say, well, if you can't get out of that situation, it's your fault. You know, this kind of personal narrative that's layered on top of that. And I think that has to play a role implicitly or explicitly. I mean, I have my critique of implicit discrimination, but, you know, like, you know, implicitly or explicitly in how communities of people get viewed when they arrive at healthcare settings and in institutions. And, you know, undoing that is going to take so much work. And it might not just be about some of those things that seem obvious to us, even though all the transformations that have been mentioned are amazing and let's get them going. But it seems like some of that's so deep in the background that we have to go there too.
Well, I want to thank you all for this. We really could take this show on the road because there's so much more to explore, but our time is coming to a close. As we began the space of the pandemic, we also saw police violence taking place, not new, right? Because the death of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many others pre-existed COVID for sure. But as I think about women on the front line, certainly Breonna Taylor comes to mind for me. And thinking about essential care workers, and women are disparately people who do the care service, whether we're talking about in hospitals where they make up more than 90% of the people who are doing important care work, not just as doctors, but also as nurses, as orderlies, and you work in other capacities outside of the hospital setting, as cashiers, as waitresses, and so much more. Even though the face of meatpacking often is male, there are a lot of Latinx women who work in meatpacking. Meatpacking was considered essential care work during COVID. And prior to Latinx women playing such an essential role in meatpacking, historically that had been Black women too. And so as I think about the work that you all have done in your papers, and that all kind of overlapping with both COVID and expressions about police violence, and I think about Breonna Taylor as an essential care worker, and it strikes me that even though there are people that we title to be essential, and this ties to what you were saying, Jasmine, we don't treat them necessarily in that way. What we've actually seen is that some people who bear the title of being essential workers actually seem fungible and expendable. And I think through your papers, your commentaries, what you've helped to do is to bring out these narratives, to complicate these spaces, to talk about what these issues mean in society, to talk about the role of law, to talk about the enduring types of issues that we see within our society and within our culture, and what we need to do to elevate the concerns of women and elevate the concerns of women in myriad kinds of ways. Thinking about women with disabilities, LGBTQ women, women of color, and so much more. So I want to thank you all. And I want to thank Victor and Nick and the Cornell Law Review for joining us in this effort. And I also want to thank the Hastings Center for being a co-sponsor, the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, the Harvard University Law School Petrie-Flom Center, Harvard Center for Bioethics, and also Ms. Magazine for joining us today, and then also beyond with publishing commentaries and lifting up these your important voices and the subject that you all were talking about. So thank you all very, very much. I'm going to turn it over to Victor and Nick now.
Thanks so much, Professor Goodwin. So again, I'd just like to thank Professor Goodwin and Dr. King, and also Professors Ahmed, Andrews, Harris, Siegler, and Whalen for holding these necessary discussions on the role of women during and beyond the pandemic and the perpetuation of inequalities that continue to affect women. For our viewers, early next year, Cornell Law Review Online will be publishing the amazing essays and articles of these scholars exploring the ongoing issues affecting women, again, during the pandemic and thereafter. I had mentioned this to Professor Goodwin back in March when we were just brainstorming this amazing event. But as someone who was raised by my mother, a single parent, an immigrant, and a current home health aide, this is definitely a deeply personal issue to me. I think this is an issue that should be personal to everyone. And as the symposium authors urge, these issues merit everyone's passion and urgency to resolve the inequalities that continue to impact women currently and will continue most likely after the pandemic. So again, thank you to everyone here and to our co-sponsors. And that's all I have.
And with that, we'll conclude. Thank you all so much. And I also want to thank Mariah Lindsay and also Stephanie Wilner for helping behind the scenes, Will Alvarez, and also Marsh Allen, who took care of our engineering and tech today.